Good afternoon. We're going to get started now. So thank you for coming out on this very beautiful April afternoon. Couldn't ask for better weather. I'm Kelly Mitchell, and I'm Executive Director of the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. And you are here for Robina's Incarceration series. Today we're going to talk about mass incarceration. And as the name of the series implies, it's going to be a conversation. We want to hear from you. So we're going to start the morning off, or the evening off, or afternoon. We're going to start off with three panelists. They're going to give you some information about mass incarceration, how we got here, what some of the trends are, whether or not, information about has it been the same everywhere. And then we want to hear from you. We want to give you an opportunity to tell us, ask your questions, tell us your impressions of what you've heard today. Tell us what you think, where should we go? Where should we go from here? So we'll really want to engage with you and hear what you think about this particular topic. So I'm going to introduce our speakers now, and then we'll get started. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Brown. She is our visiting scholar at the Robina Institute. Professor Brown is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Niagara University, and she'll be joining the Sociology Department at UMass Boston in the fall of 2014. Following Professor Brown will be Kevin Rice. And Professor Rice has been a professor of criminal law and procedure and criminal sentencing for the past 26 years, 9 of which he spent here at the University of Minnesota. Currently, Professor Rice is the reporter for the American Law Institute's revision of the Model Penal Code sentencing provisions. And then closing out our information this morning will be Richard Fraze. And Professor Fraze is the Benjamin N. Berger Professor of Criminal Law here at the University of Minnesota. And his work focuses on sentencing guidelines, punishment theory, and comparative criminal justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Brown.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, I'm very pleased to be here today to share with you some of my research on state-level incarceration rates and variations in those rates over time. In academic circles, a great deal of attention has been paid to the dramatic rise in incarceration rates in the U.S. since the late 1970s, after decades of relative stability. There's good reason for this attention. The U.S. now has the highest incarceration rate in the world. This phenomenon is often referred to as mass incarceration. I think it's important to point out that the term mass incarceration has been used in a variety of ways. It's used to describe a condition, the seemingly pervasive reliance on incarceration. It's also used to describe an era in which incarceration increased dramatically. And finally, I see it used as a description of a policy approach in which prisons and incarceration have been used as a political vehicle and for expressive goals. As this image depicts, overall rates of incarceration at the state and federal levels have grown at least 500% in the last 4 decades, from approximately 100 per 100,000 people to 500 per 100,000 people. When jail populations are included, the U.S. currently has a rate of approximately 750 per 100,000 people. But the vast majority of incarceration occurs at the state level, and those rates alone have increased over 400%. These increases in incarceration have come with profound fiscal costs for states and social costs, particularly for young black males and for the poor who are disproportionately impacted by prison population growth. Given the significance and scope of incarceration, a rich body of research has developed to explain the so-called criminology of mass incarceration And I'm borrowing that term from Mona Lynch, who used it in a paper she wrote and published in 2011. Central to narratives about mass incarceration is evidence that trends in incarceration cannot be fully explained by changes in crime rates. This image shows violent crime rates and incarceration rates from 1977 to 2010. While violent crime rates do predict some of the growth we've experienced, the overall association between crime and incarceration is actually quite weak. Research suggests that sentencing policy shifts, the politicization of crime, demographic changes, and economic factors may be even more important to consider than crime rates. One of the concerns that I've had in the study of mass incarceration is that both theoretical narratives and empirical study have tended to focus on the national level. We know, however, that there are huge variations in incarceration across US states. In fact, there is as much variation between and among states in the US as there is between different countries. This image shows patterns in 4 states. In 2010, Louisiana had the highest rate at 867 per 100,000 people, while Minnesota had one of the lowest at 185 per 100,000 people. That's a 5-fold difference between Louisiana and Minnesota. Maine actually had the lowest rate at 148. The distance between states has actually grown in the last 40 years, with the standard deviation in state incarceration tripling. In 1977, the standard deviation was 53, and in 2010, it was 146. So not only has the overall average rate increased, but the spread around that average has increased as well. Given the scope, costs, and collateral consequences of reliance on incarceration, it's important to understand variations among states and over time. Research on state-level incarceration has tended to use time series analyses to examine shifts over time. While those studies rely on state-level data, they essentially group all states together to explain national trends. In my research, I've taken a different approach, one that considers patterns of incarceration among groups of states. I assume that the dynamics of incarceration rate change in states might be different depending on their pattern. I recently finished a project that uses group-based trajectory modeling to evaluate patterns of incarceration from 1977 to 2010. Trajectory modeling is a statistical method that's used to find the best fit for patterns in data. This analytic approach, which was developed by Daniel Nagin and others, has most often been used to explain individual level phenomena like juvenile delinquency or health outcomes for patients over time. I'm using it in a slightly different way by applying it to states. Trajectory analysis isolates patterns within data and puts people, or in this case states, into groups that best fit their pattern. It does this by a maximum likelihood estimation and by fitting polynomial functions to data. This method provides post-estimation probabilities for how likely it is that a particular unit, again in this case states, fits within a particular group. In other words, it can tell you how well your data fit the patterns identified. It can also identify and test for significance of group-specific relationships between variables. For example, it can help to answer questions like, how do changes in crime rates impact changes in incarceration within each of the groups when you control for other factors? The best fitting model for 1977 to 2010 identified 3 groups of states. This image shows the patterns for the 3 groups. Those that experienced a minor rise, the blue line, those that experience moderate increases and slight declines, the red line, and the high rise and slight decline group in green. I found that for the low to moderately increasing groups, the red and blue lines, that previously found relationships generally hold up. That is, incarceration is higher in states with larger young black male populations, more violent crimes and drug arrests, and higher percentage of Republicans in state legislatures. Incarceration is lower in states with determinate sentencing, with more liberal citizens, and where more money is spent on public welfare. But for the high-rise group, the group in green, those that saw rates go from 100 to approximately 700 per 100,000 people, those established models start to fall apart. This map shows the distribution of states in particular groups. And I'd like to point out a few things about the green states, those states that had the highest rate of increase and with slight declines in recent years. In that group, violent crime and drug arrests did not have statistically significant relationships with incarceration. Incarceration was entirely disproportionate to crime rates. Partisanship and political ideology also failed to reach significance in those states. And this is somewhat perplexing, because those relationships are very strong in the other two groups. The green states, all of which are in the South, have lower percentages of Republicans in state legislatures than on average during that period. And this explains to a certain extent the weakness of the partisanship variable. But even so, I imagine that the conservatism of Southern Democrats would cause ideology to be related to incarceration. I decided to break this 34-year time period into two periods to see if there are any period-specific effects that might be occurring that would provide more information about this. It's important to point out a couple things before I continue, however. There were two variables that were consistently related to incarceration across all three of these groups. The percent young black male in the population was positively related to incarceration, so that as that population increases, incarceration also increases. And determinate sentencing was consistently and negatively related to incarceration, so that states that have determinate sentencing have lower incarceration. As you look at this map, it's also important to point out that two states were excluded from my analysis. Alaska was excluded because it has very high revenue from energy sources, and I had revenue and spending variables in the models that would have broken the models down. Nebraska was also excluded. You can see that it's depicted here in white because it has a unicameral and nonpartisan legislature. For the second phase of my analysis, as I said, I broke 34 years down into two 17-year periods, from 1977 to 1993, and from 1994 to 2010, in order to look at period-specific effects. For 1977 to 1993, a two-group model was the best fit for the data. In this model, partisanship and determinate sentencing had a bigger impact on states with higher incarceration rates, those states in the red group here. But the overall differences across variables was much less pronounced in this model. This map shows the more scattered distribution of states in this earlier time period. For 1994 to 2010, a three-group model was the best fit. In this period, the percent Republican was actually significantly but negatively related to incarceration in the high-rise group. And the same effect was found with a measure of conservatism rather than partisanship. In the high incarcerating group, the more conservative the politics and the more Republican the state legislature, the lower were the incarceration rates. In recent years, Republicans have been stressing their efforts to lower prison populations, with Grover Norquist just recently claiming party leadership on the issue at the Conservative Political Action Committee meeting last month. There certainly has been a lot of talk about smart on crime and right on crime initiatives in certain states. And at the federal level, George W. Bush's Second Chances Act has been influential in reframing reentry and rehabilitation. These findings, at least for the period from 1994 to 2010, seem to indicate that rhetoric has been translating into a certain amount of action in some states. However, it's important to stress that recent shifts I've identified are in the very states that put the mass in mass incarceration. While we've seen some slight dips in prison populations in recent years, the future of incarceration in the U.S. is unclear. There are conditions in place now, low crime rates, fiscal difficulties in states, and possible shifts in perception about prisons and prisoners that may make it possible for decarceration efforts to move forward. But incarceration is and may remain a deeply ingrained institution in many places. As attention is increasingly focused on the possible end to the era of mass incarceration, I would argue that it will be important to continue to examine patterns of incarceration across states rather than aggregating data to the national level. Thank you.
Good afternoon. We're going to get started now. So thank you for coming out on this very beautiful April afternoon to Mass for Better Weather. I'm Kelly Mitchell, and I'm Executive Director at the Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. And you are here for Robina's Incarceration series. Today we're going to talk about mass incarceration. And as the name of the series implies, it's going to be a conversation. We want to hear from you. So we're going to start the morning or the evening off, or afternoon. We're going to start off with three panelists. They're going to give you some information about mass incarceration, how we got here, what some of the trends are, whether or not, information about has it been the same everywhere. And then we want to hear from you. We want to give you an opportunity to tell us, ask your questions, tell us your impressions of what you've heard today. Tell us what you think, where should we go? Where should we go from here? So we'll really want to engage with you and hear what you think about this particular topic. So I'm going to introduce our speakers now, and then we'll get started. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Brown. She is our visiting scholar at the Robina Institute. Professor Brown is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Niagara University. And she'll be joining the Sociology Department at UMass Boston in the fall of 2014. Following Professor Brown will be Kevin Rice. And Professor Rice has been a professor of criminal law and procedure and criminal sentencing for the past 26 years, 9 of which he spent here at the University of Minnesota. Currently, Professor Rice is the reporter for the American Law Institute's revision of the Model Penal Code sentencing provisions. And then closing out our information this morning will be Richard Fraze. And Professor Fraze is the Benjamin N. Berger Professor of Criminal Law here at the University of Minnesota. And his work focuses on sentencing guidelines, punishment theory, and comparative criminal justice. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Brown.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, I'm very pleased to be here today to share with you some of my research on state-level incarceration rates and variations in those rates over time. In academic circles, a great deal of attention has been paid to the dramatic rise in incarceration rates in the U.S. since the late 1970s, after decades of relative stability. There's good reason for this attention. The U.S. now has the highest incarceration rate in the world. This phenomenon is often referred to as mass incarceration. I think it's important to point out that the term mass incarceration has been used in a variety of ways. It's used to describe a condition, the seemingly pervasive reliance on incarceration. It's also used to describe an era in which incarceration increased dramatically. And finally, I see it used as a description of a policy approach in which prisons and incarceration have been used as a political vehicle and for expressive goals. As this image depicts, overall rates of incarceration at the state and federal levels have grown at least 500% in the last 4 decades, from approximately 100 per 100,000 people to 500 per 100,000 people. When jail populations are included, the U.S. currently has a rate of approximately 750 per 100,000 people. But the vast majority of incarceration occurs at the state level, and those rates alone have increased over 400%. These increases in incarceration have come with profound fiscal costs for states and social costs, particularly for young Black males and for the poor, who are disproportionately impacted by prison population growth. Given the significance and scope of incarceration, a rich body of research has developed to explain the so-called criminology of mass incarceration. And I'm borrowing that term from Mona Lynch, who used it in a paper she wrote and published in 2011. Central to narratives about mass incarceration is evidence that trends in incarceration cannot be fully explained by changes in crime rates. This image shows violent crime rates and incarceration rates from 1977 to 2010. While violent crime rates do predict some of the growth we've experienced, the overall association between crime and incarceration is actually quite weak. Research suggests that sentencing policy shifts, the politicization of crime, demographic changes, and economic factors may be even more important to consider than crime rates. One of the concerns that I've had in the study of mass incarceration is that both theoretical narratives and empirical study have tended to focus on the national level. We know, however, that there are huge variations in incarceration across U.S. states. In fact, there is as much variation between and among states in the U.S. as there is between different countries. This image shows patterns in 4 states. In 2010, Louisiana had the highest rate at 867 per 100,000 people, while Minnesota had one of the lowest at 185 per 100,000 people. That's a 5-fold difference between Louisiana and Minnesota. Maine actually had the lowest rate at 148. The distance between states has actually grown in the last 40 years, with the standard deviation in state incarceration tripling. In 1977, the standard deviation was 53, and in 2010, it was 146. So not only has the overall average rate increased, but the spread around that average has increased as well. Given the scope, costs, and collateral consequences of reliance on incarceration, it's important to understand variations among states and over time. Research on state-level incarceration has tended to use time series analyses to examine shifts over time. While those studies rely on state-level data, they essentially group all states together to explain national trends. In my research, I've taken a different approach, one that considers patterns of incarceration among groups of states. I assume that the dynamics of incarceration rate change in states might be different depending on their pattern. I recently finished a project that uses group-based trajectory modeling to evaluate patterns of incarceration from 1977 to 2010. Trajectory modeling is a statistical method that's used to find the best fit for patterns in data. This analytic approach, which was developed by Daniel Nagin and others, has most often been used to explain individual level phenomena like juvenile delinquency or health outcomes for patients over time. I'm using it in a slightly different way by applying it to states. Trajectory analysis isolates patterns within data and puts people, or in this case states, into groups that best fit their pattern. It does this by a maximum likelihood estimation and by fitting polynomial functions to data. This method provides post-estimation probabilities for how likely it is that a particular unit, again in this case states, fits within a particular group. In other words, it can tell you how well your data fit the patterns identified. It can also identify and test for significance of group-specific relationships between variables. For example, it can help to answer questions like, how do changes in crime rates impact changes in incarceration within each of the groups when you control for other factors? The best fitting model for 1977 to 2010 identified 3 groups of states. This image shows the patterns for the 3 groups. Those that experienced a minor rise, the blue line, those that experienced moderate increases and slight declines, the red line, and the high rise and slight decline group in green. I found that for the low to moderately increasing groups, the red and blue lines, that previously found relationships generally hold up. That is, incarceration is higher in states with larger young black male populations, more violent crimes and drug arrests, and higher percentage of Republicans in state legislatures. Incarceration is lower in states with determinate sentencing, with more liberal citizens, and where more money is spent on public welfare. But for the high-rise group, the group in green, those that saw rates go from 100 to approximately 700 per 100,000 people, those established models start to fall apart. This map shows the distribution of states in particular groups. And I'd like to point out a few things about the green states, those states that had the highest rate of increase and with slight declines in recent years. In that group, violent crime and drug arrests did not have statistically significant relationships with incarceration. Incarceration was entirely disproportionate to crime rates. Partisanship and political ideology also failed to reach significance in those states. And this is somewhat perplexing, because those relationships are very strong in the other 2 groups. The green states, all of which are in the South, have lower percentages of Republicans in state legislatures than on average during that period. And this explains to a certain extent the weakness of the partisanship variable. But even so, I imagine that the conservatism of Southern Democrats would cause ideology to be related to incarceration. I decided to break this 34-year time period into 2 periods to see if there are any period-specific effects that might be occurring that would provide more information about this. It's important to point out a couple of things before I continue, however. There were 2 variables that were consistently related to incarceration across all 3 of these groups. The percent young black male in the population was positively related to incarceration, so that as that population increases, incarceration also increases. And determinate sentencing was consistently and negatively related to incarceration, so that states that have determinate sentencing have lower incarceration. As you look at this map, it's also important to point out that 2 states were excluded from my analysis. Alaska was excluded because it has very high revenue from energy sources, and I had revenue and spending variables in the models that would have broken the models down. Nebraska was also excluded. You can see that it's depicted here in white because it has a unicameral and nonpartisan legislature. For the second phase of my analysis, as I said, I broke 34 years down into two 17-year periods, from 1977 to 1993, and from 1994 to 2010, in order to look at period-specific effects. For 1977 to 1993, a two-group model was the best fit for the data. In this model, partisanship and determinate sentencing had a bigger impact on states with higher incarceration rates, those states in the red group here. But the overall differences across variables was much less pronounced in this model. This map shows the more scattered distribution of states in this earlier time period. For 1994 to 2010, a three-group model was the best fit. In this period, the percent Republican was actually significantly but negatively related to incarceration in the high-rise group. And the same effect was found with a measure of conservatism rather than partisanship. In the high incarcerating group, the more conservative the politics and the more Republican the state legislature, the lower were the incarceration rates. In recent years, Republicans have been stressing their efforts to lower prison populations, with Grover Norquist just recently claiming party leadership on the issue at the Conservative Political Action Committee meeting last month. There certainly has been a lot of talk about smart on crime and right on crime initiatives in certain states. And at the federal level, George W. Bush's Second Chances Act has been influential in reframing reentry and rehabilitation. These findings, at least for the period from 1994 to 2010, seem to indicate that rhetoric has been translating into a certain amount of action in some states. However, it's important to stress that recent shifts I've identified are in the very states that put the mass in mass incarceration. While we've seen some slight dips in prison populations in recent years, the future of incarceration in the U.S. is unclear. There are conditions in place now, low crime rates, fiscal difficulties in states, and possible shifts in perception about prisons and prisoners that may make it possible for decarceration efforts to move forward. But incarceration is and may remain a deeply ingrained institution in many places. As attention is increasingly focused on the possible end to the era of mass incarceration, I would argue that it will be important to continue to examine patterns of incarceration across states rather than aggregating data to the national level. Thank you.
Most of you, or many of you, may know that before we talked her into coming to work here, she was the executive director of the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission and on the executive committee of the National Association of Sentencing Commissions, and back earlier in her career worked for the Supreme Court of Minnesota, so she knows an awful lot about sentencing, corrections, how government works, and all the issues that the Robina Institute cares deeply about, and the work that we try to do here. Now, following Elizabeth on this panel, I should say I'm not a social scientist. I'm a lawyer, and I'm not even like Richard Fraze, who will come up next. I haven't invested a lot of time teaching myself methodologies in the social science world. So what I do primarily is work with big, simple numbers. Not sophisticated at all, but given the condition of the United States and the phenomenon of mass incarceration, just the sheer size of what's been going on, you can actually get a lot out of big, simple numbers. Our numbers are very big here. Now, as Elizabeth said, the growth in prisons in the U.S. Is different in every state, and different effects by period. Ending in 2009, we had something like 37 unbroken years of prison growth in the U.S. dating back to the early 1970s, and that is quite a run. The largest increases in prison size over those decades were in the 1980s and the 1990s. You probably can't read this chart, but this goes all the way back to 1880. And the big blue bars towards the right are counting the number of prisoners added to U.S. prisons in that decade. Okay, so it's just counting people. So in the 1990s, we had over 600,000 prisoners added to U.S. prison populations just in one decade. 1980s was a little bit behind that, and the early 20th century, third in line. So the high growth period, got underway with, got some head of steam in the 70s and then really took off in the 80s and 90s. There was some de-acceleration, and for the past few years, we're actually seeing some slight drops nationwide in incarceration rate. I should say a lot of that is due to California, which is under federal court order. Now, Elizabeth mentioned this, but the effects of rising incarceration in the U.S. Are strongly disparate by race and ethnicity. This chart goes back to 1880 and just shows the black male incarceration rate in the blue bars next to the white male incarceration rate in the yellow bars. And what you see for both groups over the course of time is relative consistency and growth in incarceration, but it's hitting much harder in the black population than in the white population. In the current statistics published by the Justice Department, the black male incarceration rate is reported there. This is per 100,000 population. Nearly 3% of black males are in prison on any given day. The white rate of 463 is a fraction of that. The black male rate, it says on the bottom of the slide, is more than 6 times the white male imprisonment rate in this country. And that's actually come down a little bit from the turn of the century in the late 1990s. A huge difference in just the likelihood, if you are a black male, that you'll spend time in prison, as opposed to white male. The Hispanic rate currently is about 2.5 times the white rate in prisons, and that number has been pretty stable for a while. Now, you surely can't read this, but I just want you to note all the different lines and the different lengths of those lines. This is going back to 1980. It's a date I tend to focus on because it's the date Minnesota adopted sentencing guidelines. But this goes through the the really high growth decades of prison growth. And what this chart asks is how much prison growth did each state experience. So all 50 states are on the Louisiana's at the top with the most prison growth. It's corrected for population, so this is growth in the prison rate. We see huge differences from top to bottom in how much the prison systems have expanded in various states. Now here's Minnesota third from the bottom. In this last 30-year period, or in the growth period from 1980 to 2009, Minnesota prisons grew like every other state, but only North Carolina and Maine experienced less prison growth than Minnesota in the last 30 years. Now, there are two issues that I want to focus attention on just in a couple of minutes that I have remaining. One question that a lot of people ask nationwide, and it's addressed directly in Elizabeth's paper, is whether or not indeterminate versus determinate sentencing makes a difference in prison growth. Indeterminate sentencing, for those of you who don't know me, is a system where there's a parole board that decides when people get out of prison. So a sentencing judge might say your sentence is 2 to 10 years. And it's the parole board that decides, are we going to release the person after 2 years, or 3 years, or 8 years, or 10 years. So in an indeterminate system, there's a parole board deciding the release date for prisoners, or at least the vast majority of prisoners. In a determinate state, it's much more dependent on what the sentencing judge says the sentence will be. As in Minnesota, the sentencing judge pronounces a prison sentence. and there's some discount for good time, but that's going to be the sentence. There's no parole board later on deciding when people will get out. Now, an awful lot of people in the U.S., I would say it's even conventional wisdom, believe that states that have parole boards sitting there allowing people to come out of prison should have lower incarceration rates than other states. That parole release is often called early release. A lot of people think of parole boards as agencies of lenity. We're shortening sentences when we let people out. We're not necessarily keeping them in for their maximum term. Well, over the last 30 years, or actually going back more towards 40 years, I've charted here the experience of the states that have abolished the parole board. They've taken the parole board away, so it's more like Minnesota. The sentencing judge has a lot more to say about what the actual sentence will be. And I'm going to show you two charts like this, so I'll just explain briefly what's going on here. For each state, and I can give you the names of some of the states. For each state, I started chronologically with the year when they enacted the law that got rid of the parole board. And then the red bar shows how much prison growth that state has experienced ever since. Okay, so every one of these lines is a somewhat different time period because it depends on when they adopted their law, getting rid of the parole board, so that judges had more to do with sentencing than the parole board. So the first state is California in the mid-'70s. And California is one of the states where the prisons have grown quite a bit. The black bar right next to the red bar is the average amount of prison growth among all states. Okay. Now this is very consistent with what Elizabeth found. Of all of these jurisdictions, there are 14 of them displayed on this chart. Only 3 states that have taken away the release discretion of the parole board. Only in 3 states has the prison population in that state increased more than the national average. Okay, so something like 2/3 of the states that have adopted determinate sentencing laws have seen prison growth that is lower over that period of time than the national average. So for every one of these states, the red bar shows how much prison growth that state experienced. Right next to it is how much prison growth on average the U.S. experienced nationwide. Now here's Minnesota, and just focusing on Minnesota, we see a lot more prison growth since 1980. That's the black bar in Minnesota, than in our state, which is the smaller red bar right next to it. There's one state that adopted a determinate sentencing law in 1995 and actually experienced negative incarceration growth, some incarceration shrinkage since then. Now this is an interesting finding. It's confirmed by Elizabeth. But it's an interesting finding because it at least should cause people to question the conventional wisdom. A lot of people think, particularly if they live in a determinate state, they think, oh, one way we could get our prison populations down is reinstituting the parole board. Maybe that's what we did wrong in 1980 or 1990. We got rid of the parole board. Well, bringing parole discretion back into a sentencing system doesn't seem to be very reliably associated with less prison growth. The recent history is just the opposite. Now, the other feature of legal sentencing law that I studied is whether or not a state has adopted a sentencing commission. So in Minnesota in 1980, we did 2 things. We adopted a sentencing commission that creates sentencing guidelines for judges, and we got rid of the parole board. So Minnesota is a sentencing guideline state, and it is also a determinate sentencing state. Around the country, people have all sorts of different systems now in the early 21st century. Now, if we just ask the question, among those states that have adopted sentencing guidelines and have removed the prison release discretion from the parole board, what's happened in terms of prison growth? Okay, there are 9 states that have done both of those things, at least for a long period of time, starting with Minnesota over there on the left in 1980. Every state that has adopted that kind of a system, sentencing guidelines and determinate sentencing where there's no parole release discretion, every state, 9 out of 9, has experienced less prison growth under that system than the average among other states. Okay. There's Minnesota. Now the last slide I'll show you just compares states of different kinds. These bars just show how much prison growth on average have different types of states experienced depending on the kinds of law that they have. All the way on the left is the Minnesota system, pioneered here in 1980. It's a determinate sentencing state with sentencing guidelines. Those states, on average, have experienced the least prison growth of any sentencing type over the last 30 years. Oh, well, this chart is saying from 1995 to 2000. You get exactly the same appearance if you go back to 1980. You can pick different dates, you get the same results. The second slowest growing state are the states that are determinate but no guidelines. They've taken the parole board away, but they don't have sentencing guidelines. Well, they get a little more prison growth than the Minnesota system. The third, and now we're getting into the high growth territory, are states that have a parole board and don't have any sentencing guidelines. And interestingly enough, the states that have created sentencing guidelines and have kept the parole board in place to decide when you really get out of prison, those are the jurisdictions that have experienced the most prison growth over the last 20 years, or if you could go all the way back to 1980 and you get the same results. So the two messages I'd like to leave you with today is I think the legal structure matters, at least it has mattered in our recent history. The way we put together the institutions who decides what in our prison sentencing systems, it seems to make a difference. And I'm not enough of a social scientist to make strong claims, but at least there's some presumption here that the Minnesota system, compared to other states, has been doing some things right. And that for the future, moving forward, if we're making choices among these different kinds of structures, it's useful to know what the track record has been. Okay, I'll turn it over to Richard.
All right, well, I'm going to, as this indicates, I'm going to bring it home and focus on Minnesota, building on the two previous presentations. Not only because we're in Minnesota, but because, as they have already shown, Minnesota is kind of at one end of a spectrum, and actually in a couple of ways, not only in terms of growth, but perhaps even more importantly, in terms of the scale of imprisonment that we have and have always had. And why is it? So anyway, the bottom line from all three of the presentations is that you have to disaggregate, as social scientists would say, the U.S. Pattern to look at individual states, because we are as different as if we were all different countries. And so just to reprise Professor Brown's slide, I'll steal this for a minute just to remind us sort of the range that we have even at the beginning of this period, 1977. Those may look close together, but in percentage terms, they're quite far apart. So that in 1977, Louisiana's per capita incarceration rate, and that's the number of inmates per 100,000 state population. It's a way, per capita rates are a way of accounting for the fact that California, with 20-some million people, is bound to have more inmates than Rhode Island. So you do it per capita, per state resident. And actually, recently, there's a move to do it per adult state resident, because fortunately, there are very few juveniles in state prisons who are even eligible to go there. So anyway, these are per capita rates, although Louisiana and Minnesota are about the same size state. But it's per capita. But even at the beginning, Louisiana had over 3 times, about 3.5 times, the per capita rate that Minnesota had. And as was already pointed out, by the end of this period, Louisiana had almost 5 times the rate. So let's look a little more carefully at those two states and then focus on Minnesota. So What we're seeing here is not only these ratios that I just mentioned, 152 over 44 is 3.4, and 867 compared to 185, and for the 2010, the end of this time period we're looking at today, is almost 5 times higher incarceration rate per capita. But notice just before I leave it, even though Minnesota has been put in the low incarceration rate, low growth state, and so some people say, the problem is we're just not locking up enough people. Just think how much crime we could control if we were to lock up as many people as Louisiana. Well, I just want to come back to the question of prison and crime control. But one thing to notice here is that since 1977, Minnesota, on a per capita basis, has grown over 4 times, 4.2 times higher rate in 2010 than we had in 1977. So we do have a kind of mass incarceration here relative to what we had in 1977. And this underscores a point that was in one of Professor Brown's first slides that showed that 1925 through 2010, and notice that if you look at that carefully, you would see that from 1925 until about the 1970s, for the country as a whole, the rate was about flat, at about 100 inmates per 100,000 population. And then it began to shoot up, and it's now about 5 times that. So we didn't go 5 times, we went 4.2 times, but in a shorter period of time was measured here. And the question is, should we just view these much higher rates in Minnesota or nationally as the new normal? Were we that wrong for 50 years in the United States when we had that flat rate, 1/5 what we have now in the United States? So for Minnesota, I would say, those who think, we ought to be doing what Louisiana did, one question is, well, when we were doing what we did in 1977 in Minnesota, were we not locking up enough people? What's changed? Maybe we ought to be looking at the things that have changed and fixing them and not trying to fix things at the end of the Band-Aid of putting people in prison. So that's just a little sermon about mass incarceration, yes or no? I mean, yes, because, it's really grown in Minnesota. No, it hasn't grown as much as some other states. But even with that 4.2 times higher rate in 2010, Minnesota retained its near the bottom ranking. So if you rank all 50 states by their per capita incarceration rates, you get, as was mentioned, Maine at the bottom, Minnesota the second lowest in 2010, also in 1993. It was third lowest in 1977, or tied. So in fact, Minnesota even improved its ranking slightly, and it's at the bottom, in spite of this growth. So how did we do this? How was it that Minnesota, starting really low, didn't just sort of become more average over this time period? How did we retain that low rate? Well, of course, one of the things that per capita incarceration rates do not control for is crime rates. They control for the size of the state, but they don't control for whether the state has got lots and lots of crime and lots of criminal cases and people being convicted, because the more people that are being convicted and sentenced every year, the more people are eligible to go to prison. And all things being equal, the more will go to prison. So is it because Minnesota just has really low crime rates? It always has, it still has. It is one reason. It is one reason why the states with the low per capita rates and with the low growth are in that category. But it's not the only reason. It's certainly true, and you can prove this with FBI crime statistics and arrest statistics. Louisiana, remember that one with almost 5 times the incarceration rate? They do not have 5 times the crime rate. They do not have 5 times the felony conviction rate. So it explains some of it, but by no means all of it. Well, the second possible reason is that Minnesota just is locking people up somewhere else. In particular, we'll put them in county jails. And it is true that Minnesota does very often put people in county jail as a condition of probation, rather than sending them to state prison as a penalty for a felony. On the other hand, there is data that's most recently 2005, but it's been done several times, adding in all people in local jails as well as the people in state prisons, and doing the incarceration rate on that broader custody basis. Minnesota is still the second lowest state. So that high use of jail sentences, it is a way to shorten sentences, to keep people in the community where they can be visited, where they can go out to work or education or training during the day. But it isn't the reason. That heavy use of jail sentences is not the reason Minnesota has a low per capita rate, and it's not the reason that our growth rates are low. Well, what about other factors? Something about the water here, or it's too cold to go out and commit a crime. Well, you don't talk about crime. I don't know. Yes and no. There is a tendency, if you look at rankings of states over time, there's a tendency for states that are at the low end to stay low, and states that are at the high end to stay high. So, for example, if you looked at the 10 states that were the lowest ranked per capita states in 1977, by 2010, 7 of them were still in the low 10, and Minnesota was one of them. Interestingly enough, the other low states in 2010, only one other state besides Minnesota, that would be Massachusetts, in the low 10, has a major metropolitan area and all the crime and other problems that go with that. The rest are states like Maine, Rhode Island, well, they're partly urbanized, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Vermont. So, I think people ought to be saying, what are they doing in Minnesota and Massachusetts? In spite of their major metropolitan issues, modernity, and so on, what are they doing to keep their incarceration rate low? So anyway, there is a tendency to stay where you were over time, but there are always some that change places. There's a general phenomenon in statistics called regression to the mean. If you measured something at time 1, and you get a sort of the bell curve of some people are average and some people are out of one extreme or out of the other extreme, the cases out of the extremes in the next time period, especially over a longer period of time, are more likely to find themselves toward the middle. So the regression to the mean or to the average is a general statistical phenomenon. And given that only 7 of the 10 stayed there, there are some outliers. So particularly, I would point to Connecticut and Pennsylvania, which used to be in the lowest 10 and moved up. Connecticut quite a ways, almost to the middle of the pack. What's the matter with Connecticut? All the other states in New England have low incarceration rates and low growth rates. Connecticut is an outlier there. I sure like to know a lot more about what happened in Connecticut over this time period. So anyway, and one more point here about whether we would have just expected Minnesota's incarceration rate to stay low because of the water or because of crime or because of various things. No, we wouldn't have expected it to stay that low, because if you look at the volume of felony convictions in Minnesota and you compare it to the available data for the nation as a whole, you find that the number of people being convicted and sentenced for felonies in Minnesota increased faster than the national average. So that should have meant that Minnesota was going to have to be sending more people to prison over this time period and would move up in the rankings, would no longer be at the very bottom of the rankings. So given the general phenomenon of regression to the mean, outliers move to the center of the pack, and the rising felony caseloads, we would have expected Minnesota's incarceration rate to rise faster than the national average and move it up from the bottom in the rankings. It didn't. Why not? Well, this is just going to repeat a little bit, but elaborate a little bit on what was said before about structures of sentencing. So when you have sentencing guidelines combined with abolition of broad parole release discretion, it tends to be associated with slower growth in prison populations. Why is that? Well, it has something to do with guidelines, and it has something to do with parole release discretion. So when you have guidelines, you can, it's a way of promoting rational, comprehensive sentencing based on data that the Guidelines Commission considers. It's a statewide policymaking process. It's all crimes at once. It's not the crime of the week where, okay, let's be tough on them. Okay, but now we have to be tougher on them, and you go in a leapfrog progression. Look at it all together, comprehensive. And it's partially insulated from political pressures. So that seems to help, rather than having policy made either in the aggregate or case by case by elected officials who are under a lot of pressure, whether it's the governor, the legislators, elected prosecutors, or elected judges. Secondly, parole abolition avoids the exaggerated release prediction problem. So, you know, it prevents somebody who just wants to show how tough they are on crime by saying, but don't worry, the parole board will let them out long before that, or if it gets crowded in prison, you know, we'll be able to let them out early. Often that doesn't happen, and especially often the parole board gets risk averse and it starts not letting people out, or not letting people out as soon. Suddenly you've got overcrowding and growing prison populations. And finally, maybe most important, guidelines and combined with parole abolition make sentencing and time served in prison much more predictable. It allows us to be much more precise up front about how many people are going to be in prison 2 years out, 3 years out, 5 years out. And that has a number of important functions. Number one, it tells the legislature, look out, you're going to have to expand prison soon because you're going to have an overcrowding problem. Minnesota's avoided overcrowding in part by this kind of accurate prediction and resource matching, it's sometimes called. We can also set priorities. So you can say, if we really want to put these guys in longer, who can we not put in so long, at least while we're building more prisons? And you ought to be setting priorities. You ought to be deciding who do we want, who most needs to be locked up, who doesn't need to be locked up, or at least as long. And finally, it just focuses on those really severe, really expensive proposals. So we can say, wow, that is going to have this enormous bed impact. And all that human life is just going to be lost, locked up, and the cost to raise taxes. Where are we going to get the money? Let's see if maybe we can tailor that proposal, make it a little more focused. Do we really need to lock all these people up for all that time? So it gives a very valuable scrutiny to severe proposals. This has worked in Minnesota. It happened over and over again. It happened when they designed the guidelines in 1979 because they were able to, if somebody says, I want to lock these people up for a long, long time, and somebody say, yeah, but we've only got so many prison beds, so who are you going to let out if you want to put those people in for 10 years longer? Okay, we'll figure that out. And then as time went on, over and over again, there would be a proposal to, okay, let's stop these people, let's be tough on these people. Okay, what's it going to cost? Do we have the beds? And how are we going to get the money if we don't have the beds? So it's worked in Minnesota over and over again to restrain the growth in prison populations, and it's worked in quite a few other states that have used this approach. At least when it's used seriously, it works. So anyway, the conclusion here is pretty much what other people have said. One of my favorite quotes is from Zimmering and Hawkins, The Scale of Imprisonment, 1991 book, in which they have a chapter called 51 Different Countries. And that's almost what different states in the United States look like, both at any one time and in trends over time. It cries out for analysis because it isn't all just crime rates or conviction rates. Choices about sentencing law and policy do make a difference. We've tried to show you today some of the concrete ways in which they do. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we have a question right there.
Hello, I'm Mark Hazy with the Council on Crime and Justice. Professor Fraser, you touched on this a little bit. My question is relating to what you talked about regarding felony conviction rate, and the fact that Minnesota's rate has increased greater than other states. It seems to me that focus on mass incarceration can mask some of those other effects. In Minnesota, I believe about 25% of felony convictions result in incarceration. And even I think the focus, as you mentioned, on prison bed costs, I would hypothesize maybe has allowed legislators to be even harsher when it comes to creating new felony penalties if there's not going to be the corresponding increase in incarceration rate and costs. And I'm just wondering if you can say more about how we compare to other states as far as felony conviction rates, and if none of you can comment on that very much, if there's somebody who's focusing on that issue in their scholarship. Thanks.
I guess I'm not sure I know how to break down the difference in the overall figures that I mentioned, where for the period where there's comparable national data to Minnesota data, the Minnesota increase in felony conviction rates was like almost twice as high an increase. And a lot of that is certain categories of crime. So obviously drug crimes, but that's true everywhere. But we had meth before it got to some parts of the country, so that was a big bump up in the later part of this period. toward the end. Felony DWI, we went to that. Some states haven't, some did it earlier. Domestic assault, we've had a lot more cases in that category. It would be an interesting question to know how much of this is law enforcement and prosecutorial policy. And underlying that, I think I heard you suggesting that maybe the on the criminalization question of what is made a crime and how serious a crime is made, maybe a downside of the focus on the bed impact is we say, well, if we don't think it's going to have a bed impact, well, then we can afford to broaden the scope of the criminal law and the theoretical penalties, and we're tough because it's not going to cost anything, except that it does cost the court system and humans.
The impact is really great.
I have a question over here. Or does anyone else want to take a stab at that question? All right, great.
Hi, I'm Anthony Duff at the law school here. So it looks like guidelines are a way forward. But what matters really is not just whether there are guidelines, but who sets them and how they're appointed and how they're protected against short-term political pressure. So you know what that guideline states. Are they all the same in that kind of institutional structure, or are there different structures?
Well, I could say something about that. They are different. The guideline system that is really different is the federal sentencing guideline system, because the federal prison budget is such a trivial part of overall federal spending that changes in federal sentencing law, even if it's going to add prison beds, doesn't raise the same kind of attention as in most states under the various guidelines systems that are operating in all the states that I had up on the board. The ability to project costs is made in an environment where people are worried about money, or often are worried about money, as opposed to the federal system. So I think, at least on my chart, that's part of why you get that 9 for 9 lower incarceration rate, because every state is worried about its budget. So when they're told, well, yes, you could ratchet up for attempted armed robbery, but here's how many beds it would cost, and here's how much money it would cost. Just putting the price tag on is an inhibitor at the state level. And we see in the Federal Commission, if you take that away as a factor in the analysis, then guidelines don't necessarily run in the same direction. We've had huge federal prison growth under sentencing guidelines. But I just think it's a different environment. If you're in most state legislatures, especially today, are experience a lot of budget pressure. So that's a big piece of what's on the table every time.
I would add to that, there's really good evidence that the state level, the intentions behind guideline systems make a huge difference in their eventual impact. So to your point about finances, certainly states that enact guidelines with the intention of reducing spending, sort of reining in spending, they have much more impact. And it'd be nice to be able to map that onto a longitudinal kind of picture, but certainly it seems to make a big difference.
We have a comment back here.
I came in late. The second presenter, Dr. Brown, I believe. Is that your name?
Yep, that's me.
Oh, okay. Well, the second presenter.
Oh,
Kevin.
The growth rate where Louisiana was on the top of. Do most of the states tend to be in the South in those figures?
Right. I think Elizabeth's research speaks to this too. That the really high incarceration states and the really high growth rate, growth states in the last 20 or 30 years tend to be in the South.
All right. Now,
or Southwest.
To blow that theory, North Carolina has had negative rates.
Right.
What have they done?
Well, they copied, for the most part, they copied the Minnesota system. And they were in terrible crisis. They were under federal court order, and in 1980, North Carolina was the #1 prison state in the country. And they had such difficulty with their prison populations that people were coming in and serving 9 or 10% of their terms, and then they get out. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction in North Carolina that they were in crisis, that the things had gotten so far out of hand that it was a train wreck. And they turned to the Minnesota system as a way to fix it. And it really is a striking example of how the Minnesota system, as Elizabeth said, combined with the intention of controlling costs and controlling prison growth, can work. Every time it's been tried, it worked. And North Carolina, largely because they had such a train wreck, brought the system in and set it on a course that it's, for the most part, been successfully running on ever since.
And I believe that, sort of relating to President Duff's point about different commissions, the commission there actually, I believe, initially recommended a more severe package. The legislature said, no, that's not what we want. It's going to cost us a lot more. So this was, even though this was in the early 90s, this was already a situation of being very aware of the budgetary consequences and beginning of the anti-tax movement. So it was the legislature that was very much in control of limiting, bringing down their rate and their ranking as a high incarceration state.
Okay, if you could pass the mic just forward, right in front of you. The next question's from here, and then I know we're going to go over there.
Hi, I'm Zach Hoskins here in the law school. So my question was about something that came up in Professor Rice's, but it's a question to any of you. I'm wondering if we narrow our focus to states that have indeterminate sentencing, why is it in those cases that the guideline states we get more incarceration, or why is that higher than the non-guideline states?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit of a puzzle, but it's basically, you know, all types of indeterminate states tend to be the high growth state, and the guidelines are just a little higher. And I think what's really going on is what Richard Fraze said, that the states that have parole release discretion, I mean, in theory, if you get a sentence of 2 to 10 years, the parole board can let you out after 2 years. And maybe 40 years ago, the parole board would let a lot of people out after 2 years, but their behavior has changed so dramatically over time that no parole board member wants to release the guy who then goes out and kills a cop. And so everyone before them, it's easier just to say, denied, you're going to stay in for a while longer, than to take that chance. So I think what Richard said earlier, the heightened risk aversion of the parole board has turned those sentences. If you've got a 2 to 10 year sentence, maybe in 1970 that would average out to be a 3-year sentence. And now it's averaging out to be a 9-year sentence. And no one changed the law, it's just that parole boards are more gun shy. And so I think it's mostly indeterminacy. I mean, why you grow more in the guidelines data, I mean, that's still a little mysterious to me.
Right, over here.
When you're looking at the costs of the prison, that being controlled more in Minnesota because of the abolishing of the parole board and the guidelines, has there been any comparison of the cost that Minnesota spends on probation and rehabilitative programming, chemical dependency treatment, mental health treatment, the type of programming costs that we are spending as compared to other states?
All I can say is we are undertaking a study of that kind at the Robina Institute. That's been launched in the last several months. So I hope we can tell you a lot more about how Minnesota compares with other states in its probation, uses of probation, and the nature of that.
My hypothesis would be that we are, I mean, some people have said Minnesota's a land of 10,000 treatment centers. And even though we went to a determinate sentencing system that some people thought was a rejection of rehabilitation, it never was rejected here, especially community-based. The fact that we have a low prison rate means we have a high proportion of people in the community where there are more resources and where the focus is more on keeping them out of trouble. And of course, the fact that we've managed to avoid overcrowding in prison means that we can actually still do some treatment in prison. Whereas if you've got 50% overcrowding, there's no room and there's no staff for anything but just warehousing people. And the first thing that goes, besides safety, is treatment.
Okay, we've got a lot of people on this side of the room that want to talk.
Then Bob Tennyson, I was going to ask you, excuse my cutting in and out. Dick, you sort of touched on it, but what effect has the community corrections program had on incarceration in Minnesota? What studies have been done? The second part is what, the incarceration rate is the number of people in prison per capita, and we've increased the length of sentences in Minnesota a lot beginning in the 80s. How has that affected incarceration rate? Any of you.
Okay. Well, I'll just jump in. The Community Corrections Act, I mean, we were one of the first states, I think, to have a Community Corrections Act, and it was at least originally designed so that there was state money going to local jurisdictions so they could have programs, and they didn't have to just send people to the state because the state would pay for it. I mean, this has sometimes been referred to as the correctional free lunch, where local decision makers, prosecutors, and judges either don't have the money or don't want to spend it because if we send them to the state's going to pay for it. And so you got a disconnect between decision about where a person goes and who pays. And that's bad both in terms of sort of the democracy and accountability, and it's not probably the most efficient way to do it. So we incentivized community corrections early on. I guess I'm not aware of studies that have recently sort of looked at what we're doing that's still under the current version of that, other than what I was saying about just having more people in the community with more of an emphasis, therefore, on community-based treatment of them. And your second question.
The length of the terms of sentence has been increasing.
We know that the average length of prison sentences imposed and served in Minnesota under the guidelines went up in the 90s. It's a direct result of legislative changes and legislatively mandated changes in the guidelines. So that was a choice was made. We want more people, these people anyway, they're mostly violent offenders, to serve more time in prison. So the growth in Minnesota is more or less true everywhere, I think, but break it down into some of it's caseload. You get more people convicted, all things being equal, you're going to have more prisoners. But secondly, what percentage of people get sent to prison? That hasn't changed too much in Minnesota. It's roughly a quarter or a third from year to year. The duration of the prison sentences has gone up. So in our system, they serve at least 2/3 of that sentence. And so to get longer sentences, you get more prisoners.
Yeah, I should just add on the sort of probation prison link. All the graphs that you saw today about how much prison growth there's been in the U.S. in the last 30, 35 years. If we had a graph of probation, it would show just as much or nearly as much growth in probation. We have someone in the audience, Professor Michelle Phelps, who's in the sociology department, has done a lot of research on probation and prison and how one maybe affects the other. What seems to happen in a lot of states is, we used to think in the 1980s, well, if you use probation more, that probably means you're using prison less. But instead, they both go up. And one of the effects that you really have to be careful about in just looking at probation, the more people you have on probation, all of those people are at risk of being revoked if you screw up in some way. You don't come to all your meetings, you're getting urine tested, and you get a dirty urine, something else happened. Then you're sent to prison. So the people who are in the community on probation or parole after they get out of prison, they're all at risk of being sent back to prison. And through recent decades, 30 to 40% of prison admissions are these revocations. So there's like a feedback effect in a lot of states that the larger your community corrections population, the larger your revocations flow will be into the prison. So growing community corrections, if you don't do it carefully, can actually be a feeder to growing your prisons as opposed to an alternative to incarceration, which is what we used to say in the 1980s.
And I would just add to that, there's some interesting things happening in different states and localities to try to break that cycle a little bit. So I don't know if anyone saw last week, there's a New York Times article about a program in Massachusetts, sort of a pay for success type of program that tries to incentivize localities to stop that process, to stop the sort of revocation process, to get people, stop them from going to state prison. And there's an interesting movement known as social impact bond where community groups and different groups that work in rehabilitation are actually having investors buy into their approaches to try to see what they can do to actually stop that kind of cycle from continuing. So just to add that on, is kind of recent stuff that's been changing in the field.
And to add on to your add-on, we just had a small team went out to California last week, and they're a very interesting state. California used to have the highest revocation rate in the country. 70% of their prison rates were revocations. They weren't new sentences where someone got sentenced. And just 3 years ago, California passed a law because the Supreme Court said they had to do something, big about it. So, now in California, if you're in prison, you cannot be revoked and sent to state prison. So they went from 70% of their admissions were revocations to 0. If someone's on probation and screws up, well, maybe they can spend some time in the county jail, but you can't send them back to the county. So at the state level, there's some experimentation with breaking this cycle. And California is going to be really intriguing to watch to see how all this works out.
In the back there.
Hello. So I don't know if this is even the right arena for this. My question is, so in other words, we talked about treatment in prison, and there's treatment in prison, but it's almost like taking Spanish in the 7th grade and then never seeing anybody Spanish speak Spanish. By the time you get out, you forget it. So to have treatment in prison and then come out and be stuck in the same community where all your challenges are, puts you at a real high risk of having your probation revoked, right? You can't move anywhere else because you got a felony. You're just stuck in a certain environment. And then the other question is, when we compare Minnesota, we kind of most likely we do have, in comparison to other states, we're doing good with incarceration, but for the people who live here, other states don't matter. And I just wonder, is there any statistics on how we are globally in areas of our size? Like how are we doing globally?
Well, we're almost twice Canada's incarceration rate, for example.
So we don't
in
brag
Minnesota,
about
and we're way above the UK and most European countries. So the international comparisons, if you're just looking at Minnesota, would still put us high in international terms. I mean, not nearly as high as Louisiana and Texas. But
America's incarceration rate has not always been that much higher than other developed countries. So we had this huge growth since the mid-70s, and for various reasons they didn't.
This question has to do with our significant black male incarceration, and at 6.1 times greater than the white male. And I'm wondering, number one, when you're looking at those statistics, is that due to, has there been an increase in the percentage of black members in our population that has caused that increase? Is it because people are witnessing violence and being subjected to a violent situation in which it's a repetitive and that cycle of violence is not repeating? Do we know what the factors are that, or is it simply socioeconomic reasons that we have a larger black population in the prisons?
Well, a huge part of the equation, I think, has been political framing of the crime problem to include a racial component. The idea, especially getting into the 1980s, was that drugs and violence was an issue, related to young black males. You saw that in the media, you saw it in campaigning. So I think that that's a huge piece of the puzzle, is sort of the racialization of crime that is political, it's cultural, it's media, it's public opinion, it's all of those things combined.
I guess I would just add that you can see that particularly in drug laws and in crack laws in particular. But now, even Minnesota got rid of the distinction between crack and powder cocaine 20 years ago because it was having such a major racial disparate impact. But we still have higher than national average. If it's 6 to 1 for Minnesota, it's well over 10 to 1 in Minnesota. I haven't actually done the gender specific, but just for African Americans in general, it's about 10 to 1 now, so it would be a higher ratio for black males versus white males. I took a look at this some time ago. You can see most, but not all, but most of that disparity at the beginning of the process at the arrest stage. There are very substantial disparities in arrests, racial disparities, nationally and especially in Minnesota. And it isn't, some of it is police policies about where drugs are being, where drug enforcement takes place. Open air drug markets tend to be urban and non-white. But some of it, especially for poverty and violent crimes, it does seem to be behavior. That's what the victim surveys show, and it's consistent with race and poverty and crime being all three closer together. If you look at Minnesota, and I looked at this, if you look at the disparities in socioeconomic measures, which are substantial all around the country on whether it's education, poverty levels, income levels, residential stability, half a dozen major socioeconomic measures. African Americans are always much more disadvantaged than white Americans, and that's especially true in Minnesota. And it has partly to do with the patterns of immigration here, that people have not been here as long, that they're mostly living in high crime urban areas. In the South, they're more likely to live in lower crime rural areas. I think when you drill down to these problems, yes, some of it's law enforcement decisions, but some of it is behavior, and that is unfortunately very closely tied to socioeconomic disadvantage. And we can almost, I have a colleague who sort of looked at the sort of the neighborhood prison pipeline. The people are disproportionately going to prison from certain zip codes. You can pretty much map them, and they're all the most disadvantaged, most segregated areas. So that's what's driving this ultimately.
I didn't hear the term racism.
Well, I'm not going to say that there aren't some people who are or become in their work not racist. There's certainly plenty of people that apply stereotypic values and assumptions to the decisions that they make. So that's a kind of racism. If we're talking about entrenched socioeconomic disparities, or what's sometimes called institutional racism, or the legacy of slavery, if you will, it's kind of racism.
Can I respond as a black male to the question? There's a couple things. When you said drugs, did you say they're more prevalent in the urban community, or just more, the enforcement is more prevalent in the urban community?
Enforcement is more prevalent because the drugs tend to be more visible.
Right.
Open air drug markets as opposed to dealing in private, which is harder for the police to.
I agree. I just want to clarify that. As far as the influx of African Americans or black males in Minnesota, I don't know what those numbers are, but there's certainly a greater amount of young black men who grew up without a father due to the laws from 1980, the crack laws of 1980 that specifically targeted enforcement in the urban communities. So you have, I don't even know what the numbers are, but there are, you have plenty of households where you have young black males whose mother still has to bring 10 or 12 hours of work a day, and they're raising themselves in a community where sources are very scarce. So that's a huge contributing factor.
Yeah, I just mentioned, we haven't talked a lot about crime rates today, but one of the things that's really just part of the politics and the overall environment of anything in criminal justice these days is that crime nationwide has been coming down quite dramatically for more than 20 years. And I think it gives everyone more political space to talk about differences, that's a good thing. And crime rates and victimization rates in the poor black communities of the country have been coming down even more than anywhere else. So there are some things that are going on over the past decades that look like they're incremental changes for the better, along with all the slides we put up that are pretty horrific.
So So I have to interject here. We've reached the end of our time. This is a really great conversation. There are a lot of people who still have questions. And so we invite you to continue the conversation with us. We have a reception immediately following this presentation up in Auerbach Commons, which is that glassed-in area that's right near the front door. So can we give a round of applause to